edge designations, FRM Part II, operational risk and resiliency, introduction to operational risk and resiliency. This is the first topic in what we call ORR, operational risk and resiliency. In the past, it used to just be called operational risk. The new readings relating to operational risk or the op risk section have now been introduced with operational risk and resiliency. Having a look over here at the learning objectives, we have a look at the operational risk management framework. We'll take a look at that. The 7 Basel II event risk categories, characteristics of operational risk exposures. We'll talk about loss events, etc., and operational resilience and the elements of an operational resilient framework. And as you can see, more and more we're going to start to speak, when we talk about operational risk, we include resiliency in that discussion. Let's get ourselves going straight away. Introduction to operational risk and resiliency, learning outcome. Describe an operational risk management framework and assess the types of risks that fall within the scope of such a framework. Okay? And those that are familiar with operational risk will know that there's no real formal definition, and it's difficult to put forward an exact definition for op risk or operational risk. Some of the definitions, some good, some not so good, okay, are all risks that are not market or credit, which is, I think, is not the best definition, of course, knowing that there are so many other risks out there as well. Op risk could also be risks stemming from a breakdown of normal operations, risks stemming from internal sources like fraud, or risks stemming from ineffective or inefficient systems, personnel, or external events. Business risk is generally excluded from op risk. Okay, when we talk about the definition that comes through from Basel, the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, they define op risk as the risk of direct and indirect loss resulting from inadequate or failed internal processes, people and systems, or from external events. Okay. Operational risk management needs to be fully integrated into the risk management processes. Op risk is often referred to as non-financial risk because it's got to do more with people and processes. An integrated and centralized framework was developed to manage risk. And of course, by now in our FRM careers, we all know that to be called enterprise risk management. Risks related to op risk, okay, the BCBS, okay, the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, focuses on the sources and the impact of the loss. Okay, clearly, okay, we need to look at legal risks as well. Okay, but importantly, it excludes reputational and strategic risk from there. The following risks are related to op risk. We've got legal risk. Okay, what is legal risk? The risk of being sued over a transaction or anything that the firm fails to do. The risk that a contract will not be upheld in a court of law. Top of page 3, business risk. We know what that is. That's the risk relating to the business itself. In other words, demand for the firm's product. Is the pricing that we're using correct? Okay. There may be a certain amount of uncertainty surrounding production and admin costs. Okay. And business risk, as we know, okay, if we get that one wrong, that can result in large losses to a firm. These risks are not included in op risk, strategic and reputational risk. And strategic risk is the risk of investing in an investment, okay, with a large degree of uncertainty involved. Okay. Looking at reputational risk, the loss of risk or the risk of loss of trustworthiness of a firm to meet its financial obligations. Okay. And again, reputational risk can lead to large losses and can even destroy a business. We know many cases of this out there in the market. Learning outcome, describe the 7 Basel II event risk categories and identify examples of op risk events in each category. Okay, and this is quite important that we know these categories quite well. Okay, op risk can be broken down into 7 categories per the BCBS, the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision. Number 1 is we call EDPM, execution, delivery, and process management. In other words, failure to process transactions correctly or inability to maintain relations with counterparties. Clients, products, and business practices. Okay, any practice, and you can see it's quite people related, this whole concept of op risk. Any practice that fails to fulfill the obligation towards a client goes into this particular category. Business disruption and systems failure, power failures, hardware failures, software failures, things like that. Internal and external fraud are number 4 and 5. Internal fraud is failure to obey the law, okay, trading, data misrepresentation, etc. External fraud is failure to obey the law by a third party, things like theft, fraud, or things like that. Employment practices and workplace safety. Any practice that does not follow the correct law and procedure when dealing with employment and workplace safety. And number 7 is damage to physical assets. Okay, that's number 7. Okay, these categories are what we call level 1 categories of op risk. It's always important that we've got these 7 categories, okay, but that every business that we have is active in all 8 lines of business practice. So in truth, what we need to do is, if we're looking at a complete picture of op risk, we need to address these 7 op risks for each and every one of the 8 lines of our business. Okay, when working with op risk losses, we look at the following 2 losses. Important, of course, loss frequency and loss severity. Loss frequency is how often that loss is likely to occur. Generally, we measure that within a 1-year period. And loss severity is the size of the loss. Okay, if there is going to be a loss, what's the value of that loss? And in most cases, okay, we look at these 2 losses as independent. Okay, and these 2 losses can vary among the different categories, the 7 categories of operational risk. Okay, and what we need to do is we need to do a bit of a mapping process. So an operational risk taxonomy, or the mapping process, is the process that we undertake for risk identification and classification of the operational risks of the company. Okay, and remember what we said, we've got 7 different categories of op risk, 7 categories of operational risk, and those can be broken down into further levels after that. We'll look at those as well. For example, when we look at the first of the 7 categories, we call that EDPM, execution, delivery, and process management, which has got a high frequency of loss. Okay, it can happen very often, and a high severity of loss. If it does happen, well, the losses can be quite severe. And if you look over here, we break this particular risk down into further categories, which we're going to call over here level 2 categories. Okay, as we look at this particular table. Okay, so what are some of the other, what are some of the level 2 subcategories of our main level, called level 1, called EDPM? Some of the subcategories are transaction capture, execution, and maintenance. An example of that is data entry, miscommunication, etc. Monitoring and reporting, customer intake and documentation, customer client account management, trade counterparties, and vendors and suppliers. That's just an example of how we can break down that the major risk, level 1 risk, for the 7 different categories into level 2 subcategories. Due to its high level of frequency and severity, okay, you can see there's many level 2 risks that we need to address, because not only is this a particular risk, EDPM, a risk that is frequent, but it's also a risk that it can be quite severe as well. Okay, in a financial firm, EDPM has the highest frequency of occurrence. Okay, and why specifically in a financial firm? Because there's a large volume of transactions that go through the books on a daily basis. Okay. And if you look at a financial institution, for example, a bank, margins are low, volume is high. Any kind of miscommunication and data entry errors that occur, if they are common, okay, which they generally are in this type of environment, not difficult to miskey a little a button on the keyboard, that can lead to large losses. This needs to be addressed very effectively. Top of the next page, okay. Another very common level 1 risk is clients, products, and business practices. Okay, high frequency and again high severity of loss. Okay, But it's important to note that this particular one of the 7 called clients, products and business practices, yes, it's got high frequency and high severity, but not as high as EDPM. EDPM is the bad one. Okay. And again, what we do over here is we break this risk down into further subcategories, which we call level 2s, suitability, disclosure, and fiduciary. Examples of risks: fiduciary violations, disclosure issues, privacy violations, and churning of accounts, improper business or market practices, product flaws, selection, sponsorship, and exposure. Okay, and different advisory activities. Do take a look at some of those. Third category is called BDSF, business disruption and system failures. Less common than the first 2. Okay. And examples over here include hardware, software, and telecommunications failure. The 4th category, which was external fraud. 5th was internal fraud, but let's go back to the 4th one of external fraud. It's got 2 subcategories: theft and fraud, and system security. 5th category is internal fraud, also got 2 categories, subcategories: unauthorized activity. This is internal to your business, so things that happen that are unauthorized transactions. And then theft and fraud as well, things like embezzlement, misappropriation of assets, etc. 6th event is called employment practices and workplace safety. There you've got employee relations in one of its 3 subcategories, a safe environment, and diversity and discrimination. Looking at the 7th and final category is called DPA, damage to physical assets. Okay, and it's got one subcategory called disasters and other events, and this relates to any kind of disaster, from a natural disaster, human losses from external events, things like vandalism, things like that. Over the page, learning outcome: explain characteristics of op risk exposures and op loss events and challenges that can arise, and describe operational resilience. And as you can see, more and more as we go into the process, those that have been in the system for a while would say, well, we don't remember too much about this resilience concept. It is when they made all the changes for resilience in 2023, okay, for op risk, resilience was one of the big ones that was added into the process. Okay, let's get ourselves going straight away. An integrated and centralized framework was developed to manage risk. And if you remember this well from FRM Part 1, this was called enterprise risk management. Okay, a large component of these activities are related to op risk management, and as such, financial institutions make use of these when they develop their operational risk frameworks. Since ERM is a relatively new concept, we don't have a standard definition for it just yet. When we look at things like COSO, Committee of Sponsoring Organizations, and the Treasury Commission, they said ERM is a process. Okay, and you think to yourself, well, 2004 was quite a while ago. Yes, but it's a fairly, it hasn't been around. When you say it's fairly new, it hasn't been around for, I suppose, hundreds of years, perhaps. Okay, ERM is a process affected by an entity's board of directors, management, and other personnel, applied in strategy setting and across the enterprise. And you can see over here the keys across the enterprise. We work risk on an enterprise basis, not on a silo or individual risk basis. They're trying to identify potential events that may affect the entity and manage risks to be within the firm's risk appetite, and to provide reasonable assurance regarding the achievement of entity objectives. Okay. IOS, International Organization of Standardization, they said, what is this? It's the risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives, and risk management refers to the specific activities to direct and control an organization with respect to risk. Okay. Doesn't matter which definition you use, but it's important to note that ERM is a value-added function. Okay, and there we go. The risk management cycle, look at the 4 actions. Number 1, and hopefully, guys, this is not something that's brand new to people. We've seen this before in previous studies, particularly FRM Part 1. Risk identification, identify the risk assessment. And remember, when we talk about risk assessment, remember, most of the time we're looking at how frequent that risk will occur, likelihood, okay, and then, of course, we talk about severity as well. Risk mitigation, how we can reduce the risk, and risk monitoring over there. Top of page 7, it's got a lovely little picture over there. Okay, and just really an example of matching risk management techniques with risk management activities. Okay, and you can see we'll just go through one of them. Risk identification, that's over there. Okay, and of course all this fits in where? Operational risk management and framework. Governance on the top, and of course conduct and culture play a major role there as well. Okay, let's have a look over here. Nature and features of op risk. What are some of the unique features? Remember, op risk differs a little bit from what we've seen thus far in terms of market risk and credit risk, and it's heterogeneous. Hetero means not homo. Homo means singular, the same all the time. This is hetero, okay, because the risk comes from many diverse areas. Okay, and each type of op risk will materialize in a unique way dependent on whichever business line you are dealing with, okay, and whichever type of service you're with. Okay, idiosyncratic. Due to the nature of op risk, every person needs to manage the risk dependent on the task at hand. Okay, heavy tails, losses over here in op risk, and we've seen this. I'm sure people are very familiar with things like the Bearing Banks disaster, and all those kind of financial disasters. We saw that all in FRM Part 1. A lot of those stemmed from op risk. And what do we see with a lot of those? That the amount of risk is significantly high, okay, and they've got big tails. Of course, they would call those left tails, wouldn't we? Okay, and how? So if someone had to say, well, let's define op risk, what would you say? Op risks are small generally, but when they occur, they are severe. They are interconnected, they are highly complex, okay, and they can arise in many different business operations. They are dynamic, okay, they continually evolve, okay, as we go through the process. Resilience, what is that? Okay, the first regulatory guidance on resilience came from the UK, and they were the first people to publish a paper giving guidance on operational resilience, and they said, okay, what exactly is this thing called resilience? Okay, continuity of business services. Important business services need to be identified. Let's talk about resilience, that if disrupted would cause intolerable levels of harm to consumers or market integrity. Impact tolerance levels refer to the quantity of disruption that could be tolerated. In other words, how much could we bear without anything going completely south? Management of this disruption, lessons learned, and continuous improvement. So this is some of the points that we look at when we look at this concept called resilience. The US regulators, what did they say? In 2020, and you can see it's fairly new, this concept of resilience, they issued its sound practices to strengthen operational resilience, and they included lines of important business services, the tolerance impact, everyone knows how much can we bear, and the view of operational resilience. Okay, BCBS, okay, the Basel guys, what did they say? They said we're looking at governance, op risk management, business continuity planning and testing, mapping interconnections and interdependencies, third-party dependency management, and we'll talk about all of these in much greater detail. Have no fear, a lot more detail on this subject is coming now. Incident management and ICT, including cyber security. Other regulators, what do they say about resilience? The European Central Bank published a draft regulation relating to resilience for financial service businesses. The MAS in Singapore, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, and the Association of Banks in Singapore also issued a paper related to resilience. So you can see resilience is a fairly new concept, and there's a lot of stuff that's coming out on it fairly frequently. That then brings us to a conclusion of this particular topic. There are some edge checkers for you on top of page 9. Make sure you're able to do some of those, and then on page 10 you have the solutions there for you.